Hello, welcome back. In the previous lecture, Hubel and Wiesel entertained us with their Star Wars Jedi Knight lightsaber-like experiment and introduced us to the concept of receptive fields. We learned about a descriptive model of receptive fields, and in particular we looked at two different kinds of receptive fields, center-surround receptive fields and oriented receptive fields. So here are some examples of these oriented receptive fields, and the question that we asked was, how are these oriented receptive fields constructed from the center-surround type receptive fields? In other words, what we wanted was a mechanistic model of how receptive fields are constructed using the neural circuitry of the visual cortex. So in order to answer this question, we need to look at the neuroanatomy of the visual system. Here's what happens to the visual information after it's processed by the retina. It flows through the optic nerve to this nucleus called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and from there it flows to the primary visual cortex, or V1. And as we know, in V1 we have receptive fields that are elongated that look something like this, whereas the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, we have receptive fields that are basically center-surround, similar to what you find in the retina. And the question that we're asking is, how do we go from the center-surround receptive fields to these elongated receptive fields? And the clue to this conundrum comes from the anatomy. So if you look at the anatomy, you'll see that a number of LGN cells converge to single V1 cells. And so what this means is that a single V1 cell receives inputs from a large number of LGN cells. And so the question then becomes, how do the inputs which have receptive fields such as this give rise to a receptive field in the output in V1 that looks something like this? So I'll give you a couple of moments to figure out the answer. So are you ready? Let's see. Here's the answer. It's actually quite obvious when you think about it. In order to form a receptive field that is oriented and looks like this, all you have to do is arrange the inputs to have receptive fields that are aligned in this particular manner. And given that there is a feed-forward connection or a convergence of these inputs onto one particular V1 cell, this particular cell is going to behave as if it has this type of a receptive field. In other words, this particular cell in V1, or primary visual cortex, is going to behave just like the cell that we saw in the Hubel and Wiesel movie. It's going to respond to any bar that is oriented in this particular way and is bright and has this particular 45-degree orientation. So this particular model is a mechanistic model of how receptive fields in V1 of this particular kind are constructed, and this was suggested by Hubel and Wiesel in the 1960s. This model is actually quite controversial in the sense that it does not take into account other inputs that this V1 cell is receiving. So if you look at the neuroanatomy in V1, you'll find that there are a lot of recurrent connections from one V1 cell to other V1 cells. So each V1 cell receives inputs from its counterparts within V1, in addition to the feed-forward inputs from the LGN. And the Hubel and Wiesel model does not take into account these recurrent inputs to V1. And it turns out that these recurrent inputs also contribute to the responses of the V1 cell. We will look at both feed-forward as well as recurrent networks a little bit later in the course when we discuss network-level models. Okay, great. Now let's move on to the last type of models. These are called interpretive models. So we're going to look at an interpretive model of receptive fields. And the question that we're asking is, why are receptive fields in V1 shaped in this particular way? In other words, why do they look like this? Why do they have this orientation, and why are they selective for bright or dark bars? Another way of asking the same question is, what are the computational advantages of such receptive fields? Now, this is the kind of question that perhaps an engineer or a computer scientist would ask. So why do we need to use these types of receptive fields? Do they confer any advantages? So let's look at one particular interpretive model of receptive fields. The interpretive model that we look at is based on the efficient coding hypothesis. So what does this hypothesis state? Well, it states that the goal of the brain, through evolution for example, is to represent images as faithfully and as efficiently as possible using the neurons that it has. Now these neurons have receptive fields RF1, RF2 and so on. So here are some receptive fields of neurons, and the question we're asking is, are these the best way or the most efficient way of representing images? And so how do we represent images using these types of receptive fields? Well, as an example, I can take these receptive fields RF3 and 4, so let's take these two, and I can just add them. So imagine that they are images. So here's a bright region in the image and a dark region in the image. Here's another bright region in the image and dark in the image. So if I think of these as just two image patches, so these two receptive fields, I can add the two receptive fields, and what kind of an image can I reconstruct? Well, if you add these two together, you're going to get some linear combination of these regions. So you have that particular shape. So there's going to be a really bright region up here, maybe a slightly bright region here, and here and here and here, because you're adding the pluses here with a little bit of the minuses over there. And you're going to get some dark regions over here. And so what you have is an image that looks something like that. So given that you are adding these two receptive fields, you have a image that you reconstructed that looks something like, let's say, a plus sign. Now, if you're given a whole bunch of these receptive fields, you can linearly combine them in this particular way. So this is just a summation sign over all the receptive fields, RF1, RF2, and so on, and each of them is weighted by some number. So these are the neural responses, and so a linear combination of them is going to give you some particular image. Now, what is the goal here? The goal is to find out what are the receptive fields, RF1, 2, 3, and so on, that minimize the total squared pixel-wise errors between a given set of images. So what are these images? Perhaps the brain is trying to optimize its representation for natural images, and so we can look at the squared pixel-wise errors between natural images and the reconstructions of those natural images, I hat. And we'll also add an additional constraint. So we want them to be efficient, and so we want these responses, for example, to be as independent as possible. We don't want all the neurons to be firing at the same time, for example. And so we can add the constraint that we want these coefficients or these responses R sub I to be as independent as possible. So given that we have now this optimization criterion, this particular idea of minimizing the total squared pixel-wise errors and also keeping these responses as independent as possible, what are the receptive fields that achieve this objective? So here's what we could do. We could start out with a set of random receptive fields. So we are assuming that we don't know what the optimal receptive fields are, and we could run our efficient coding algorithm, which tries to minimize the reconstruction error, the squared pixel-wise errors between the reconstructed images and the actual images, and we can run it on natural image patches. So why natural image patches? Well, we can assume that the brain has evolved to process natural images. In that case, if the brain is indeed trying to perform efficient coding, then perhaps it's trying to be efficient on these types of images, natural images of plants and trees, etc. And so we could take these kinds of images and run our efficient coding algorithm on tiny patches. So here's an example of a tiny patch. So you can randomly sample from different locations on these natural images and then run the efficient coding algorithm. So what is the efficient coding algorithm? Well, there are several different kinds. So one is called sparse coding, and this was suggested by Olshausen and Field. Another one is independent component analysis, and this is suggested by Bell and Sejnowski. And then another algorithm called predictive coding was suggested by myself and Dana Ballard. This was back when I was a graduate student. I think I'm giving away my age now, but that's okay. And basically, these three types of efficient coding algorithms give rise to a set of receptive fields that have been optimized to be efficient as well as reconstruct these particular tiny image patches within these natural images as faithfully as possible. So let's look at what these receptive fields that started out as random but then they were tuned by the efficient coding algorithm, what they look like after they have converged. Aha, so here they are. What you see here is that each of these is one particular receptive field that has been learned from natural images by the efficient coding algorithm, and you'll see that each of them seems to have remarkably structure that's quite similar to what we saw before in terms of these types of receptive fields in V1. In other words, they are receptive fields that are oriented, so there's an orientation here, and they have both the white and dark regions. So in other words, the plus and the minus that we saw in the V1 receptive fields, you see them here also. And you can see that they're localized to different locations, so they're very specific to location, which is another characteristic of receptive fields. And they're oriented, and they have different orientations that span the set of orientations that you might get in natural images. And so what is the conclusion that we can draw? The conclusion is that the brain may be trying to find faithful and efficient representations of an animal's natural environment. So people have applied this principle also to other kinds of inputs such as sounds, for example, and they find that the auditory cortex representation is also quite explainable by this type of a principle, the principle of efficient coding. Okay, great. So we'll explore a variety of these types of descriptive, mechanistic, and interpretive models throughout the course. But before we do that, we have to do one thing, and you might guess what that is. No, it's not homeworks. It's being introduced to neurobiology. So a lot of you might not have a background in neurobiology. So for those of you who have never taken a neurobiology course before, the next set of lectures will introduce you to neurons, synapses, and also brain regions. So until then, adios, amigos and amigas.